Good afternoon and welcome. Thank you so much for joining us here today at the John F. Kennedy Presidential Library and Museum President's Day Festival. I'm Kennedy Library Forum producer Liz Murphy, and I am delighted to welcome our distinguished guests for today's Town Hall press conference. Second President John Adams is kindly here with us today, as well as First Lady Abigail Adams. I'm also delighted to introduce our third president, Thomas Jefferson, and our 26th president, Theodore Roosevelt. We are all looking forward to your questions today. If you're joining us here in person, please feel free to come up to the microphones in the aisles in the theater to ask your questions. If you're joining us online, please email your questions to jfkpresidentsday@nara.gov. That's NARA.gov. And we'll make sure to get to as many of your questions as we can during this press conference. Please join me in welcoming our distinguished guests to the stage. Welcome again, and thanks so much to you all for being here. I'm absolutely delighted to be kicking off today's press conference. If anyone has any early questions and you're here joining us live, please do come up to the mics in the aisles to ask your questions. Perhaps as we're waiting for our first question or two, would any of our distinguished guests today have any quick words of wisdom they'd like to share with our guests?
I would say that it is good to see all of you here today. And my most important point of this festival is that it is on I believe, a holiday from school, is it not, for you young ones? It is good that you are here and not elsewhere. And I would just close by saying that there is nothing more important than education. And that is why it is in the Massachusetts Constitution.
Mm-hmm. Any other words of wisdom, either one of you?
I would second, if you will, I would second the wisdom of our second president, with whom I had the privilege to work closely, did we not, as we were both on that committee of 5 men to draft our nation's Declaration of Independence. And we were both working at the same time on the respective constitutions of our 2 commonwealths. Mr. Adams working on the Constitution of Massachusetts, myself working on the Constitution of Virginia, the Commonwealth of Virginia. And as you heard Mr. Adams comment about the importance and the necessity of a well-educated citizen body, that was my very same concern as well with that Constitution for the Commonwealth of Virginia. So imagine, Massachusetts up north, Virginia down south, and one of the efforts to hold us together is that system of education that helps us better understand who we are.
Of course, a system of education only truly works for the nation if you are offering that education to everybody. So I would like to encourage any of the young women present, any of the people who have not been from families who can send you to expensive schools, please pursue the education that you can.
Amen.
And what do you think about school?
Well, I was homeschooled, as some people would call it today. But I was trained well, tutored well, got me into Harvard, of course. You mentioned the ladies. I told myself, Theodore, be careful about here, because there have never been any ladies like the Roosevelt women in the White House. Edith's the greatest First Lady, in my opinion, no offense, madam. She's just a wonderful, wonderful woman, but she knew this. She was aware enough of her husband's position to offer advice. And he was smart enough to ask for it and to take it.
Hear, hear.
Theodore Roosevelt liked hearing what the ladies had to say. He thought their investment in our country was so valued that we needed to pay attention to the thoughts and desires, encouragements of the ladies of the period. Of course, one of my daughters, I sometimes I don't know how to say about Alice, but Alice is one of a kind. And whether I asked her opinion or not, she was more than ready to give it. In fact, she demanded her opinion at times. So, but it made living very interesting in the White House.
I'm glad to hear you've got opinionated and strong-willed women around you in the White House, even in your time.
Thank you all for those opening words of wisdom. And all of you who have questions, I think no question too great or small for our distinguished guests today. Oh, wonderful. Thank you.
Hi.
Good day.
I have a question for all four of you. I was wondering what you believe is your greatest accomplishments throughout your lives.
Oh, indeed. Well, I would have to say being a husband and a father first, but as far as what has been done for humanity and this country, staving off that war with France when I was president. Nothing else rises in comparison during my presidency than that. Despite all of the vitriol that was going on from members of both factions and from, as we can both agree on, the newspapers, I was able to apply my efforts, whether I was in the Capitol in Philadelphia and at the end at Washington City, or whether I was home in the summer months to escape the disease of Philadelphia, avoiding that war while preparing ourselves for defense with an army and a navy, but always leaving the hand out for peace with the French. I consider my greatest accomplishment as president.
Thank you.
I look directly to Mrs. Adams, and the reason I do is because you all heard Mr. John Adams remark about his marriage being so very important throughout his entire life. I consider the greatest accomplishment, as you asked, throughout my entire life was to have acquired the hand of Mrs. Jefferson in marriage. And I say that only because the choice of your helpmate is perhaps the most important decision you make in your entire life, because does that not double the pursuit of happiness betwixt two people? It is something through which happiness can be infectious unto others when you represent that yourself. As I've written, harmony in the marriage state is the first chapter in the book of wisdom, because when one makes it the duty for the other to be happy, two of them, in kind, how do you fail? I was only married for 10 years. Many people do not even realize that. 10 short years, which I referred to as 10 years of uncheckered happiness. And we could not understand why childbirth complicated the health of Mrs. Jefferson. And suffice it to say, she did not have to live and suffer as I did the death of 5 of our 6 children, predominantly when they were young. I had to be brought from the death chamber, nearly insensible, but not before I promised her I would never marry again. I think you know I've upheld that promise, to each their own. But the one thing that can be said about those 10 short years is that I became well acquainted, most in my grief, well acquainted with that purity of happiness and true love. You know why? Because in the depths of despair, when you think you may never be happy again, rest you assured, bear with patience. Faith is not faith without believing. When our Creator closes one door, He will open another. And so therefore, yes, happiness has returned to me.
Thank you, sir.
Well put, sir.
Well,
After you.
I should say my accomplishments might not be on the same grand scale of recognition as the gentlemen around me. Of course, it was only by proximity that I ended up in some very important, very notable places. Grateful to be present around them, and oh, I really did enjoy being at the center of information, not having to wait for news to travel, but being able to be right there, hearing what people were saying about the Congress and about the presidency and about everything in Philadelphia and in Washington City, and being right there in the middle of it, when my health allowed. But as far as personal accomplishments go, it's not as if I've written any great documents or created any great governments, but one thing I really strive for my whole life long, and I do think it is one of my proudest achievements, is the betterment of the young women who would come after me. When I was growing up, I also did not have a formal education of any means. I sort of self-taught with my friends. We would write letters to each other, and if we'd read a good book or a pamphlet or discovered some little bit of history or secret or information, we'd include it in our letters and mail it off to each other. So my cousins and my friends and I in this area, even if we weren't seeing each other on a daily basis, we were exchanging information and bringing each other more of that intelligence. It was a difficult way to be educated, though, and I severely suffered from it. I wish that I'd had the opportunities to study mathematics and science, languages, histories, and the classics. So if I could have learned Latin and Greek along with the potential that was lost from not having a full education was very clear to me my whole life long, and I am so grateful that in the early years of the nation, an investment has been made in education that has begun to extend to women. But education is not the end of it. Women need to be able to be their own legal entities, to be able to hold their own property, to not be completely at the whims of their partners. Not all of us can be fortunate to be partnered with someone who is good and honest and always looking out for our benefit. There are far too many women, far too many people who are taken advantage of that way. And until you get women having their own property and thus having the ability to have a vote, to have a say in their community, if they own property, they have a stake in their area, and they can be enfranchised with a vote. If you give a vote to women, they'll have a say in what's going on around them. You might even have women holding public office, themselves being diplomats or teachers or lawyers or potentially a president of the United States. Of course, that's a long, long way from where I stand, but I've done everything in my life to promote the education of women and the betterment of those who would come after me, to the point where at the end of my life, the small bits of property that were not legally mine, but which I viewed in my heart as mine, be they things that had been passed down from my mother's side of the family, or gowns or jewelry that I had, books, things of that sort, I bequeathed them almost exclusively to the women in my life, to my granddaughters and my nieces, the women who had surrounded me, especially those who were unmarried or who were widowed, who needed a little bit of extra for themselves. I wanted even my final actions to be to promote those women and to give them the strength to build further and create a better nation that way. So that's my greatest accomplishment, if I should say, even though if it was just a few sands in the massive storm of time. So I'm sure you've got more interesting ones or more notable ones to speak of as well, Mr. Roosevelt.
I have to admit, if I were to put a list of accomplishments against such a fine resume as you've given here, I'm afraid I would fall rather short. However, if I take your question in two parts, if you're referring to the presidency, I have several things that I feel very good about. But I have to admit, and I say this to all of you right now, no man necessarily achieves on his own violation. It takes a quality of experienced people to achieve some of the most wonderful things in the world. The national parks didn't just happen. I've been called the father of the national parks. I've been given credit for creating national parks. I didn't create the national parks. God created the national parks. He just appointed certain members of our government as stewards of them. It took millions of Americans who cared that our country was being turned into, unfortunately, some cases, a garbage pit, or turned into rivers of dirt and slime and things. It took millions of Americans who said, no, we're not going to deforest the trees and ruin the wildlife habitats. It took that consensus to make. I just kind of help things along a little bit. I used the power of the presidency for what I thought was the good of all the American people. But then, to answer your question on a more personal level, I do not believe that I or any man could ask for more joy or contentment or pride than he who raises a family of young children and older children to be good citizens, to be stewards of what we have been inherited from our ancestors, to accomplish on their own, to be individuals on their own. I think a man who can look back at his family and knows he's, my case, knows he's done well, or a mother who knows she's done well, I think that's perhaps the most endearing quality a person can have when they stand before their God and say, I did the best I could, and I have this fine family to show for it. So more on a personal level, I believe the Roosevelt family is what I'm most proud of and honored about.
Hear, hear.
Here, here. Thank you. Thank you so much.
You're very welcome.
Thank you.
Thanks to all of you. And please, more questions. Come up to the aisle mics if you're here with us in person. We'll also take some online. Please take your question. Then I have an online question after yours.
How did you set the precedent as the president or first lady?
How do you set the precedent as a president or first lady?
Yes, ma'am.
All right.
That would perhaps be a question for President Washington, I would think.
I have to agree.
So my answer is rather simple. When I took the oath of office to be president with Mr. Jefferson as my vice president, I sought in my inauguration address to plan out what my administration was going to be about, and it was very much the same things that President Washington said and had in mind for the country. I warned against sophistry, which is a fancy way of saying lies in the newspapers. I continued President Washington's fear of party politics, and I worried most of all about engaging ourselves in wars in Europe and in other places. So I did not necessarily set precedents, but I continued those precedents of President Washington, although I will say the one thing that I did change from President Washington is on my way to the inauguration, I traveled in a very simple carriage without 6 white horses and all of the flummery of course, the initial inauguration, and I did ask Mrs. Adams to take the Adams coat of arms out of our carriage at home. So I guess those would be precedents.
Yes, but you still had some flummery in your occasions in the president's house, still somewhat monarchical in the methods of your gathering people together for state dinners and the like. I set a precedence, if you will, after the first 2 administrations of dining around a round table, because a round table does not have any head to the table. Everyone sits equally around that table. Now, though Mr. and Mrs. Adams were in Paris at the same time I was there, and certainly enjoyed the elegance, if you will, of French architecture, and particularly the French cuisine and French wine, well, I introduced into the president's house the French method of serving at the table, which was you do not place the food on the plate upon a server or in another room and bring it in and set it right down before the individual. That hardly gives them a choice. No, what we did was present the food in the French fashion in platters and bowls, and then what would you do? You pass it around the table. Some say, well, that's the family method. Well, it may be, but I call it the French method of passing food around the table. Thirdly, I introduced the handshake as a method of showing much more intimacy between the elected official of the people and the people who elected him. So this gave them more of a personal touch than to remain at a distance with a courtly bow. And lastly, I will say this. President Adams did not have the opportunity to follow a precedence that was set by President Washington. In fact, we would not even call it the fact that Washington set a precedence. No, he merely would not accept a third term as president. And we know he could have been president for life. Mr. Adams did not even have a second term. I won out. We need not get into it. We need not. But in any respect, I did have the opportunity for a third term, and I turned it down. I turned it down on the example that was set by President Washington, and therefore hope it may be followed by others, which indeed it was by President Madison and now President Monroe. I gave up the power for lofty office to retire under my own vine and fig.
Must they haunt me with that election?
As much as I respect your decision not to seek a third term of office, President Jefferson, that's good. I take a bit of offense with you saying that there was not precedent from the Washington administration that Mr. Adams and I had to uphold. In fact, I'd say that many of my duties, responsibilities, and expectations as the wife of the president were set entirely because of the previous wife of the president. Mrs. Washington was a wonderful woman, just very, very kind, open, giving of her time and her attention, and had long been well acquainted with hosting. She came from a wealthy family and knew how to throw a party in a way where people felt truly welcomed. And as trivial as it can sound to host a dinner party or some sort of gathering, if you're dealing with individuals, this isn't just, France comes to dinner with the United States and this is what happens. No, it's a person, this diplomat from France, who you need to treat with a certain amount of respect and make sure he is comfortable and make sure that the atmosphere is conducive for political gain, for momentum, for these actions to take place. It's setting the groundwork, having these dinner parties, having these social gatherings. And Mrs. Washington did it very, very, very well, and I found myself always striving to keep up with the example that she had set. That was the role laid out. And it was difficult because my health was poor a great deal of the time while John was in office, and I had to stay home in Massachusetts a good deal of the time. And so there weren't always those state dinners available to be hosted. And when I was there, they were much larger than anything I'd put together before. I'd witnessed some of that fine dining and fine culture in Europe, but I hadn't been responsible for putting it on before. But to be a representative of the United States of America, a new nation, on somewhat tenuous ground, you have to maintain the state of dignity of the office. And being a First Lady in that way, in that role of entertaining, of being the first host of the nation, I'd like to say it is very important, and I spent a good deal of time following the precedent of Mrs. Washington in that light. I'm curious how precedents might have been set all the way by your time, Mr. Roosevelt.
Well, I'm by nature, a kind of an energetic person. I enjoyed the office of president, And now that I think back on it, there was only one time I ever let the thought of precedent enter my administration. That was in February 1905. I just won re-election to the office of president on my own. You know, I'd come in through the assassination of, unfortunately, Mr. McKinley, and then I had served the rest of his term. And at that inauguration dinner, a reporter asked Mr. Roosevelt, "Are you going to run again?" I mean, I'd just been taking the oath of office, and they were wondering me, would I run again? And the thing is, I would have. And I was popular. I was very popular. I won by a larger plurality than anybody since Washington. It was a foregone conclusion that I could and would be elected again in 1909. But I said at that dinner table, I said, no, this is my second term. Even though I'd served almost a full term already, I said, no, I consider this my second term, and to honor Mr. Washington's precedent that he had set, this will be my last term. That was an unfortunate statement. I don't think I made many mistakes as president, quite honest, but that was one, because even my wife Edith, Mrs. Roosevelt, blanched when she heard me say that, for she knew that I'm a political animal and that I said the wrong thing, because she also knew that if I said something, I would follow through. And I had told the people of the United States I would not run again, and I wouldn't. And so she knew that right then I'd already given up what would have been a third term. I feel that's the right way, even though I ran again in 1912 because I felt that Mr. Wilson and Mr. Taft could not be good presidents. Even though I ran again, I kind of hedged a little bit, as the moderns would say. I said, that didn't count. It was, see, I set out one term, so that didn't count. I didn't say I wouldn't run again later on.
You get an extra one tacked on for
and
that.
I think I would have liked being a president again, but it wasn't to be. It wasn't to be until another Roosevelt came along and decided he didn't mind being a third or fourth president. So, and I'll have to talk to Franklin when we get back done with this. So.
Imagine.
Thank you, and please bring your questions up to the aisle mics if you're here in person. I have an online question for all of you from one of our online viewers, which is, what type of books do you like to read?
Oh, my heavens. That book I have not read as yet. I always keep my mind open to the next book published with information with which I am not familiar. Someone asked me, Mr. Jefferson, what books would you have in your library? And I answered in kind, that book that I have not read yet, and hope to read it through and to keep it there, maybe read it again. And this is the enlightenment of the human mind, to continue to open our mind and realize that education is lifelong. So I doubt I could live without books. I have a dog's appetite for books. And I like the ancient authors as well as the more modern ones. I love Shakespeare, my heavens. He is like holding a mirror up to our human nature. One of my favorite is The Life and Opinions of Tristram Shandy by the Reverend Dr. Lawrence Stern. The very same, holding up a book to our human nature. Oh, you're getting me started. I think we'll be here next year at this very moment if I continue.
Indeed, and I would speak the same. I think if our libraries were compared, they would be very much the same.
If your libraries would combine, it would make the ground sink.
It would indeed. And I remember my first book was Cicero's Orations. And along with the classics of ancient Greece and ancient Rome, a love of English poets as well, and all of the philosophers. I would second you. The book that I have not read is the one that I would wish to read now. And in the days before the war, I had an ongoing order of books coming from London. And it would continue. It would continue on to my son, John Quincy. The one place where we perhaps are different is books such as Mary Wollstonecraft's book about the French Revolution, another disagreement we have. I'm known to write in my books. I do not encourage you children out there to do the same, whatever you do to mark a passage. But if you were to go into my library and open my books, particularly that one on the French Revolution, you will find as much written by me as the original author, his or herself. I like to, as Mrs. Adams will tell you, write along the margins of the book to each passage that I agree with and disagree with. And the language can be most, shall we say, interesting in what I write, as Mrs. Adams will attest.
Now, you mean to say that the French had absolutely no reason at all to have their own revolution?
Mr. Jefferson, this book is about which literature we prefer. I know that you'll take us down the road of examining the French Revolution if we can. Maybe someone will ask that, but in the meantime, I'm going to take the book question myself.
Indeed.
The lady always has the last word.
She does indeed.
Myself, I like a great variety of things to read. As a younger person, like I mentioned before, I had that voracious appetite, just wanted to consume anything that came my way. And I still do. When I was a younger woman, I really deeply loved books of poetry, something about the way the words ignite something inside of you, a good poem. It doesn't belong on the page. It's like blood flowing through your veins. It is really a powerful thing. And as a younger woman, I memorized passages of poetry and thought I had them memorized. I know I wrote several to you, and I don't think I got the words correct in all of them, but you understood which quotes I was trying to make.
You were quoting from memory and not looking it up.
Right. In recent years, I have, you mentioned Wollstonecraft. It's a different tome of Mary Wollstonecraft that I've gotten more involved with. I'm intrigued in more revolutionary thoughts or radical thoughts, not French revolutionary thoughts, but Mary Wollstonecraft, an English writer, has written The Vindication of the Rights of Woman, study of women's rights and argument for the education of women as a means to create a more stable equality of the sexes. Not to say that the sexes are equal exactly as they are, but if you have everyone come into the world and you educate half of them and you leave the others to fend for themselves, inevitably you're going to end up with an upper class and a lower class. So offer that education to everyone, and then see who rises to the top, who takes the lead, who is really growing and advancing that way. So Wollstonecraft's another one of my favorites. I don't disagree with her nearly as much as you do in the margins, though.
You heard me muttering, I trust.
Well, I can only add that I concur with Mr. Jefferson, Mr. Adams, as far as the allure of almost any piece of literature. Now, I have to admit, I do not like trashy novels. So if you are the type of person who must read a novel before bedtime, you can just leave that off of my list. I don't care for that, but almost anything else, but especially poetry. I love poetry. I'm all in favor of. I keep my own library.
Thank you all. More questions? Please come up to the mics and ask our guests your questions. You and then
Would each
you.
of you like to share your favorite personal quote, or maybe two, something that you're known for, you wrote or you said?
That nation which expects to be ignorant and free in a state of civilization expects what never was and never shall be.
Facts are stubborn things, regardless of our inclinations.
These are the times in which a genius would wish to live. It's not in the still calm of life or the repose of a Pacific station that great characters are formed. When great necessity calls out great virtue, when the mind is raised and animated with scenes that engage the heart, then those qualities which would otherwise lay dormant wake into life and form the character of the hero and the statesman.
I have many quotes that come to mind. My favorite, which I will not go, is the critic, the credit rather. You know, it's not the critic who counts, not the man who points out where a strong man stumbled or where the doer of good deeds could have done better. The credit belongs to he who is actually in the arena.
Hear, hear.
Now, I love that. But I also love the one where if you're a common man and you have energy, why, you could steal a railroad car. But you give that common man a college degree and you can steal the whole darn railroad.
Hear, hear.
Thank you. Please.
Where was the favorite place that you ever been?
Favorite place we've ever been?
Well, I write and would write to Mrs. Adams often, whether I was in Philadelphia or whether I was in Europe, that my most favorite place to be was at my farm with my family and my books. But then, of course, I would travel to Philadelphia and various other places where the capital would move, such as Baltimore. And then I would travel across the ocean to France and to Paris and to The Hague, throughout the Dutch Republic, and then on to Great Britain. And the second time I would go to France, I would travel from Spain with not just John Quincy on the first voyage, but on the second voyage with Charles as well, by mule over the Pyrenees to France. That would probably be the worst trip that I've ever taken. Home. Being at home, at Peacefield, with my family.
I agree. I agree. I cannot add anything to it. Home. If you've had a happy home, that's where you first experience happiness and comfort. And, you know, you search for it your entire life through. Nowhere else on earth can take its place, the place of my native woods and fields. And as I've written, I hope that all my days will end where my wishes do, at Monticello.
My answer is going to be much in the same theme as Mr. Adams and Mr. Jefferson. There is no place that can hold a candle to the perfection of your own home. And sometimes you need to leave home for a time to really understand how very dear it is, how very important. I never would have thought to leave Massachusetts at all. The furthest I'd traveled was, well, I think we took that trip up to York when you were riding the circuit. So
Indeed.
Maine was the furthest I'd gone from Quincy before eventually going to Europe and seeing France and England, taking a trip to the Netherlands and viewing the cultural offerings of Europe. They were astounding. And we lived in some beautiful places. The chateau we lived in France was massive, astounding, and I really did like that house we had for that brief period of time during the vice presidency when the government was in New York City. We had that lovely, lovely house that looked out on the river. But none of these places mean anything with the joy that comes into my heart when returning back to our home, which is not just the home that brought us together and saw the beginning of our family, but that we've grown to and added to. That the house that John Quincy and Nabby and Charles and Tommy Leo grew up in, that's still there, but we have expanded, and the family has expanded as well. And there are grandchildren in the home. There are further future generations. There's all the fruits of our labor can be seen while we're there. Again, it's sorry to give you the same answer over and over, but home truly has to be the best.
Well, well said, Mrs. Adams. Yes, it's home, of course, Sagamore Hill, Long Island. You must come out and visit sometime. There's plenty of room there. But we enjoyed it as a family, and I've been as content there as anywhere. But I have to also admit, I kind of like myself wherever I'm at. I find it somehow enjoyable, whether it be the White House in Washington, D.C., or maybe Yosemite in far-off California with John Muir and the cathedrals. There's, or the lonely prairies. I just enjoy myself wherever I'm at, but no place matches home. So.
Thank you. Thanks for the great question. And please.
What was the hardest decision that you guys have ever made?
Oh, mercy.
What was the question?
Hardest decision
What was the
ever
hardest
made.
decision?
That's a good one.
Allowing Mr. Adams to take our oldest son, John Quincy, with him on that first trip to France. Now, traveling by ship across the Atlantic Ocean is incredibly dangerous. I never would have wanted to do it myself. I never would have wanted my husband to go. And the thought of letting my 10-year-old son go along with him and not necessarily ever know when they were coming back, even if the ships made it, even if they stayed healthy, even if the political ventures all lined up perfectly, I didn't have a date when they would be back home again. And I know it might be hard to understand unless you have children, but when you do have children, there is something, an invisible cord which cannot be broken. You are always feeling that awareness and that pull. And not only to have that cord be stretching all the way across the Atlantic with Mr. Adams, but with my oldest son as well. That was an incredible leap of faith and sacrifice. So, trickiest decision I ever made. I'm very, very fortunate they both made it through.
Indeed, and not to be repetitive, and despite my time as president and deciding what to do about our difficulties with France, worrying about the cabinet that I inherited, in my younger days, taking on the representation of the soldiers in the trial of the Boston Massacre, that was probably the second most difficult decision I made, was taking on that case, worrying about my family, because they were living in Boston at the time. But I would concur with Mrs. Adams, because taking on that case, I still would have been on dry land, probably hostile for most of the population in defending those soldiers. But I would concur, crossing the Atlantic in February of 1778 with my 10-year-old son, leaving my poor wife behind with the farm to manage and the other children. Though I had plenty of supplies to make myself comfortable, if you've ever been on board a ship, you know that comfort is virtually impossible, especially in February. We were at war, the threat of capture, the threat of what would happen to me if I were taken prisoner and sent to England. Believe me, I was not on the list of people that King George would let live, we shall put it that way, until the war was concluded. The threat of capture, the greatest navy of that time, although now I would say it is our navy, and I think both of you presidents would agree, but in those days it was the Navy of Great Britain, the threat of capture. We did see an engagement at sea against a British merchantman who surrendered to us because they were outgunned. There was death on board the ship from disease and from that action and from the misfiring of a cannon of a fine lieutenant. So I would say that first passage on the Boston was the most difficult decision I made, even more than taking on the defense of those soldiers.
Well, Mr. Jefferson, I appreciate you looking down here, but I have to tell you, I can't think of any hard. It was all fun. It was great. I enjoyed every decision. I enjoyed the give and take of oral argument, for a matter. I just can't remember having a hard day in office.
Bully.
Mr. Roosevelt, you are a man of a stout heart, I must say indeed.
Our future is great.
No, our future is indeed great. I can tell you this, as we discussed earlier, the pleasures, the comforts, the contentment of one's home, particularly if you've had a very happy home in youth. You know, many do not realize, but my father was only 49 years old when he passed away quite suddenly in the summer of 1757. He left my mother a widow to preside over the rearing of 10 children. I was the eldest son. I had no idea of the weight of responsibility upon my shoulders. It was the weight of the British laws of primogeniture, first genitor family, the eldest son in the family to oversee the entire estate. And you know, I was only 14 years old. You can imagine to whom I looked for a guidance, let alone a further comfort, my mother, the widow Jefferson. I not only looked forward to doing what I could to maintain the successful administration of 5 farms, well over 3,500 acres, but all I could do to maintain the health and happiness of my widowed mother. As we approached March 1776, I have been looking forward to that last day in March, the 31st of March, when I could ride to Philadelphia, and you know the rest of the history. That spring of 1776, it was on that day that my mother suddenly took ill and passed away suddenly. As the eldest son, think of the responsibility still on my shoulders to oversee her funeral, her obsequies, attend to her last will and testament. As I wrote, I nearly succumbed to a migraine headache that accompanied me for 2 weeks. Do you think I wanted to set off to Philadelphia? I had to. It was my duty. The duty called me, the duty of our nation. And as we know, the results of that duty and opportunity to be in Philadelphia with everybody else, despite that lamentable passing of my dear mother. So these are the decisions we find most difficult, but we have to make them to move forward.
Thank you. And
Thank
thank
you.
you for the great question. We have about 7 minutes left, and I know we have at least 2 questions. We have an online question if we have time, so just to say that time is running short, unfortunately, so let's get right to your question.
What's your favorite state?
What's my favorite what?
State.
State?
State? 600 miles south from here. Have you ever been to Virginia?
No.
Come and visit and you'll change your mind.
I disagree, Mr.
And
Jefferson.
indeed, not
We're going to
without
have
my
2
say-so.
firm advocates for Massachusetts on this stage.
And before we became a republic, I would, and so would Mr. Jefferson, say that our country was our respective colonies. Now that they are states, I will not say country now because my favorite country is the United States of America. But my favorite state will always be the Commonwealth of Massachusetts.
Hear, hear. Nothing can convince me otherwise. I'm with Mr. Adams on this one.
Makes me think, one more point, good sir. It makes me think of, we were speaking of lines, and I think of thoughts on government and the Massachusetts Constitution when I say, we must be a republic of laws and not of men. Massachusetts Constitution.
I think you must have seen far more states than any of the 3 of
Indeed.
us.
I
Mr.
have to
Roosevelt.
admit, you know, once you've seen Yosemite and the big trees out in California, that's impressive, but nothing is as impressive as a place called the Grand Canyon out in Arizona, which was part of Mexico when you folks were in office. And
Aaron Burr is going to try to take over it.
Indeed.
so it's
will
a
he not
wondrous,
try?
wondrous place. I suppose because it has so many electoral votes, I kind of like New York State.
I do not from my election.
Thank you. Great question. And please, and if anyone has a last question or two in the room, please do come up to the mic so we can make sure to fit you in.
What are you most proud of? What are you most proud of from changing America?
I think we are in agreement on that one, are we not,
I think
Mr.
we're in
Jefferson?
agreement. Mr. Adams and I are upon agreement, and I know Mrs. Adams is as well. And Mr. Roosevelt, looking from the future, I think would agree. We're most proud of
putting us on the road to being a country, Mrs. Adams.
And on that, some of the grand ideas you touched on, you know, of course you can't fully encompass them in one document, as well written as it is, but those ideas of equality between people, and from the very beginning of the nation, from declaring independence and saying we were no longer a part of Great Britain, that this was done on the principle that everyone comes into the world equal, that there is an equality between people, and that a government, a nation, a new idea of how to govern ourselves could be born of it. And yes, it's messy. The men who put together the Constitution did a very good job, and it's working, but it is tricky, and it takes cooperation. But the potential for not only a mighty nation, but a nation with the integrity of each of its citizens being involved in it. I think that's one of the most important things involved in the Declaration and those early changes, setting that precedent for a nation of equality.
I couldn't agree more. It was well said. I sometimes think that we kind of, as Americans, kind of look at the Declaration as if it's almost a set of laws unto themselves, and it really isn't. The Declaration isn't necessarily a law, it's an idea within us that's ours. You know, this is America.
Self-identity.
Yes,
Right.
exactly right. And that's its value, is that it's a part of us, and it's from people all through the 13 colonies to soon-to-be states. And I really do believe that is our value to it, and why we should always cherish it. It isn't just a declaration of what we intend to do. Perhaps it's a declaration of how we intend to be.
Here, here.
That's what, look.
Thank you, dear.
Thank you.
Excellent question.
Excellent.
Most favorite animal. Oh, I like that one.
Well, we have a dog named Satan, so perhaps it is not Satan. We had at the president's house a horse, Mr. Jefferson. Is there any more wonderful animal on this planet than a horse and riding a horse? And I believe in the future you will also agree with us on what a fine animal a horse is.
I never rode a horse myself, but I do have to say I love a big dog. I've got a Newfoundland named Juno myself, and she's a galumphing, beauteous thing.
Well, I have to admit, I think the buffalo is a magnificent beast. And I wouldn't mind seeing the buffalo portrayed on our national seal in some manner, or as a national emblem. So I think the buffalo is
It would be better than a turkey.
Dr. Franklin. Dr. Franklin, indeed. You know, when you're born and brought up in the wilderness, as I was, that is, in the wilderness, the forest primeval of Western Virginia, you grow up with the liking of all of nature's creatures, because you realize that extraordinary plan put into effect by the great architect of our universe, that one depends upon the other, etc. But then think of the animals that man has domesticated. That means those creatures in nature that we have made our pets. Now, I was delighted to just hear about the dogs that Mr. and Mrs. Adams own. I have heard about the great bison and buffalo out west, but I've never had the opportunity to see them. Now, I prefer cats as my favorite domesticated animal. And when you visit Monticello, make certain you go above stairs, because when you do, you'll see how we accommodate our kitty cats. The bottom panel of every single door to our bedrooms has a little hole cut into it. And there is a velvet curtain on the inside of that hole, so the kitty cats can go and come as happily and freely as they choose. But I will also admit, I'm never a day out of the saddle. Every day I enjoy a ride horseback through my native woods and fields.
Lady Washington had a cat. Do you know what she named him? Hamilton. Need I say more?
A very poorly behaved cat.
Liked the female cats.
Thank you all so much. Do we have any last quick questions? 1, 2 hands, very quick. We're just about out of time, so if these could be very quick.
Quick, gentlemen.
Good luck.
This one's actually for you, Miss Adams. What's the hardest part about seeing just being there, like on the sidelines, kind of, sort of, like, you know?
Right. The question was asked, what was the most difficult thing about being present but being on the sidelines, not being a major player in these early days of the Revolution and the early Republic? I would say one of the most difficult parts of it is patience and waiting when you don't have a vote to your own right or a respected means to contribute to the conversation. Of course, women we are vital creatures. We read, we think, we see things, we have opinions, and when you have to hold your tongue and allow everything else to play out in front of you, that's extraordinarily difficult. And I have not always been my best at holding my tongue.
I would not wish you any other way.
But the patience involved, I would say, allowing others to take the lead and trying to trust that the best decisions will be made by the leaders while not putting myself above my own station. So that's a good question.
Thank you.
Sounds like being vice president.
Thank you. Last question, please.
Oh, don't be bashful. Don't be bashful.
What president you like?
Which president do we like? Well.
Well, I can say it's an easy answer. My favorite president has to be John Adams. This man has just made his way into my heart in every way possible.
Mine too. It was an honor to serve under President Washington, however.
And remember, too, I have only known about, 6 or 7 presidents. I knew President Washington. Of course, I've known President Adams. I am the third. I know President Madison. I have known President Monroe. I have known, they tell me, who will be president, this gentleman's son, John Quincy Adams. Remember, I used to take him as a young boy to the theater when we were all in Paris.
Yes, those were dear days.
I have known Andrew Jackson, don't get me started on him, and I have known Martin Van Buren. He came to visit me in the president's house. I have known President General William Henry Harrison. I appointed him governor of Northwest Louisiana, and I have known John Tyler when he was a little boy to grow older. So there you are.
What do you like?
10.
I would say John Quincy Adams to change my answer, if I might.
Yes, we're quite fond of John Quincy as well.
Indeed.
And yourself, you've got
What
a...
do you like?
Well, I'd have to leave it up to President Roosevelt. He
Indeed.
may know far more than we
What
do.
you like?
I have had the pleasure of growing up under Abraham Lincoln. But I did not know him well. My father knew him well and had visited with him and Mary Todd, amongst others. But all the intervening presidents, clear up to Woodrow Wilson, who I do not think very much of. He was a Virginian, but he wasn't your type of Virginian. He certainly wasn't my type of Virginian. But of all the presidents, some were not given a proper due. I thought William McKinley was a president who deserved far more credit than he deserved.
One more time.
Yeah, and there were other grand men like Ulysses S. Grant, a good man, an important president in so many ways, especially the national forests and parks, those sorts of things. But quite honestly, after going down the list, I'm my favorite president.
Thank you very much. And President Adams, Mrs. Adams, President Jefferson, President Roosevelt, thank you so much for joining us this afternoon. I'm so sorry we're out of time for this session. Thanks to all of you for the great questions and for joining us today. You can get your picture taken with our distinguished guests during Paparazzi with the Presidents and the First Lady starting shortly after this session at the Presidential Seal in the lobby. And then please join us back in this room at 3:30 for our closing concert. And please join me in thanking our distinguished guests for this wonderful discussion.
Thank you. Thank you.